Right, so thanks very much for coming to this Tuesday evening lecture. First of all, I'll explain the title for those of you who haven't read Sherlock Holmes. It's the Adventure of the Silver Blaze, and the dialogue is: the detective says, "Is there any other point to which you would wish to draw my attention?" Sherlock Holmes: to the curious incident of the dog in the night time. But the dog did nothing in the night time. That was the curious incident. And in the story, it involves a horse being stolen. And the fact that the dog didn't bark means the dog must have known the horse thief. So that narrowed down the suspects. So it's an example of how sometimes finding nothing can actually be quite important in epidemiology and in life. So I'm going to explore this concept and particularly discuss the situation where perhaps you find an association at the individual level and not at the population level, or vice versa, and how with different study designs or different populations, sometimes you find something and sometimes you don't, and that's really valuable information. I'm going to do it, it's really just an excuse to talk about the main two things that I'm studying at the moment, asthma and chronic kidney disease of unknown cause. And on the surface, they're very different sorts of issues, but there are some common methodological issues. So I'll talk a bit about my asthma work, some of the work on chronic kidney disease, and then have a few slides at the end about what these two examples have in common. So starting with asthma, which I've studied for about 35 years, when I started studying asthma, this was the model that most medical students were taught, and it's pretty much what they're still taught. And in the last 20 years, I think we've knocked out every arrow for this diagram. It's completely wrong. But this is what medical students are still taught, that asthma is an allergic disease. You get allergen exposure early in life, but you become atopic, which is a particular form of allergy, and you develop what's called allergic conditions: asthma, rhinitis, and eczema. And the established, in quotes, asthma risk factors, you'll get the same answers pretty much all around the world. People believe that allergen exposure causes asthma, as well as other things like air pollution, parental smoking, stress, and occupational exposure. So this is pretty much, if you read the daily newspapers and read about asthma, this is what people will say are the causes. Now, 35 years ago, actually 1989 we started, a group of us set up this study called the International Study of Asthma and Allergies in Childhood. And there were, the problem was, before that, there'd been lots of studies of asthma, but everyone thinks their own questionnaire is best or their own method is best. And so there was very little comparable data around the world where people would use the same method comparing different populations. So I wrote a fairly simple protocol, and we did this with no money, basically, and just published it and invited people to take part in the study. And we're hoping to get 20 or 30 centres around the world, but we actually got 155 for the 13 to 14 age group, so it was about 500,000 children, and about 100 for the 6 to 7 year age group. And this was the world's first asthma map, which was published in The Lancet in 1998, I think. And it basically shows that asthma is very common in Western countries, particularly the UK, particularly the UK and US, also Australia and New Zealand. It's very low in some other parts of the world. So the prevalence of symptoms in the last year in children was about 30% in the UK and 3% in Greece and Albania. And they're only about a 2.5 hour plane flight away. So you get these huge population differences. There's a lot of other important differences in the map, which I won't go into because I'll use up all my time. But this map really demolished a lot of the myths about asthma. We followed it up with a phase 3, and by phase 3 we had 300 centres registered in 100 countries. So it's the biggest health survey ever done. It was done out of New Zealand with no money, but we made it very simple and provided some support to the people doing the survey. And these are the changes between the first survey, which was early 90s, and the second survey, which was early 2000s. And basically what you find is that asthma is a disease of Western countries. It's very high in Europe, particularly in the UK. But those countries had sort of levelled out and plateaued, and asthma wasn't increasing anymore. We think it really took off in the 50s and 60s. We still don't know why, but it increased, became very high, and plateaued out, whereas the rest of the world is catching up as they become more Western and more affluent. So we've published over 100 papers from ISAC, but the basic findings that are relevant here. First thing, that list of risk factors I gave you for asthma explain nothing about the global pattern. In fact, it's almost the inverse. For example, centres with high air pollution levels actually have very low asthma levels uniformly around the world. And they don't explain the time trends either. So some established risk factors show inverse associations with asthma at the population level. Certainly they don't explain the international patterns or time trends. The two surveys, well, we've done a third one now, but the surveys overall show that asthma is a disease of westernisation. As countries get richer and cleaner, they get more asthma. The initial explanation was the hygiene hypothesis, which was developed by David Strachan, who was part of our group, which basically says that babies are born with a tendency to allergy, and if they get an infection early in life, that switches their immune system, so they lose that tendency to allergy, and they lose the protection. Sorry, they lose the protection against allergic disease, which you get from having an infection early in life. That doesn't really hold up now, but it's become part of a more general hypothesis about lack of biodiversity. As countries get richer and cleaner, we're too clean, there's less biodiversity both in the environment and in our microbiome, and that's something we're investigating further at the moment. We got some idea as to how this was happening by a study done by some colleagues in Poland. This was a study in area of a town in Poland near Wrocław. It's nearby. There's a provincial town, and there were villages about 5 to 10 kilometres around. And people had a very traditional lifestyle. So they had traditional villages and farms. They had pigs and goats and chickens and cows and so on. And the prevalence of atopy, the findings were less strong for asthma, but for atopy, the prevalence in the town, which was more modern, was 20%. In the villages, it was 7%. It was 1/3, even though a lot of the villages worked in the town. So this was a very interesting finding. And the next year, Poland joined the European Union. And within a couple of years, they'd got rid of most of the animals because there were no subsidies. The subsidies were for crops. There was cheap meat in the supermarket. You might keep a few chickens, but most of the animals were gone. So this time they got me involved, and we went back to the same places, the same villages, and 80% of the participants were the same as the first survey. And we repeated the survey. So this is the prevalence by age in Sobotka, which is the town. So this is the first survey, and this is the second survey, and you can see it's more or less the same, that the prevalence of atopy is the same in each age group. This is what happened in the villages. This is the first survey, and this is the second survey. And at every age group, the prevalence of atopy had tripled 3 times in 7 years, I think. And the only change was they'd got rid of the animals. Otherwise, people were living pretty much the same lifestyle. When we designed the second survey, some people thought we should only study the early years of life because there's a dogma in asthma and allergy and immune disease in general. People think the first few years of life are most important, and people thought we would only see anything in the youngest children. But you see this at every age group, which is what I predicted. In fact, the whole idea that the first few years of life are crucial is just, it's rubbish. It's just based on people quoting each other. Someone said it a very long time ago, and other articles quote them, and the next articles quote them. In fact, probably the first few years of exposure are crucial. So for some exposures, that happens to be the first few years of life. But if you migrate to a new country, within 5 years, your asthma risk becomes the same as other people in the country you've moved to. If you start a new job, you can very quickly develop asthma as an adult, or allergy, or you can lose it. So the immune system is actually reversible and flexible right throughout life. It's not something where it's only the first few years of life that matter. As a result of these findings, particularly the findings for Isaac and the fact that these population patterns were not explained by the established risk factors, it got me thinking about this whole model which I'd been taught. And at the time, and you still hear this, clinicians would say 95% of my asthma patients are allergic, and the other 5 don't really have asthma, or the allergy tests are not good enough. But that's based on the people that you see turn up in specialist clinics. If you go and do population surveys, you get quite a different picture. And this was one study done in New Zealand. It was not, sorry, so this is the paper that I produced looking at this issue. And starting with a study in New Zealand, which I was not involved in, but it was a very good study. And they found for children, actually only, in this population, only 57% of asthmatics reacted to allergy tests. It's the skin prick test, where you put different allergens on the skin. And also, the children that didn't have asthma, 35% of them reacted to these tests. So even though 57% are atopic, not all of them will, you would expect 35% anyway. So you have to do the arithmetic to adjust for that. And what you find is that actually the proportion of asthma cases due to atopy overall was about 34%. And people said that's ridiculous, but we found all the comparable studies that have been done throughout the Western world, and overall, you found that overall about 2/3 of asthmatic children react to allergy tests, but about 1/3 of non-asthmatic children do too. And if you do the arithmetic, less than half of children who have asthma actually have allergic asthma. And that's pretty important because this was 25 years ago. I first published this, I think it was 1999. And when I talk about it at meetings, I was waiting for a bolt of lightning to come out of the sky and strike me dead, because people were outraged. They were convinced that asthma is a completely allergic disease. And it's about 25 years later, the drug companies are finally getting interested in this, because they're realizing that they've got a substantial group of asthmatics who actually have non-allergic asthma. And the standard treatments probably don't work so well for them. The standard preventive treatment for asthma is inhaled corticosteroids. Now, they're designed to clean up the eosinophils in the lung, and that's an allergic reaction. And there's some evidence that they don't work so well in children who have non-allergic asthma. So in the last 10 years or so, I've spent a lot of time studying this phenomena of non-allergic asthma, and we've had 2 ERC advanced grants, and I won't go into them in detail because they're sort of outside the scope of what I can do in the time available. But the first one was called WASP, World Asthma Phenotype Study. I called it World. There was only actually 5 countries we're doing it in, but I couldn't think of a better acronym. But we were doing it in UK, Brazil, Ecuador, New Zealand, Uganda. And what we're doing in each place is getting children with asthma and children without asthma, and measuring everything we can. Questionnaire, clinical characteristics. We looking at microbiome, epigenetics, a whole bunch of analyses of the supernatant and so on. We're just measuring everything we can to try and redefine the phenotypes to get beyond this sort of allergic, non-allergic classification, which is probably not optimal. And the second study, which we're doing now, involves 4 of the same countries: Brazil, Ecuador, New Zealand, Uganda. We came up with CAMERA with a bit of effort. It's a slightly better acronym. And what we're doing there is looking in much more detail at some of the non-allergic mechanisms. So I won't go into that, but I'll show you a couple of slides from the first one from WASP, just to give you an idea. So this was the first paper we published, which looked at the sputum analysis. And what you do is, I've done it once in my life, I don't want to do it again, but you inhale air with salt in it, and then with a lot of encouragement from the nurse, you cough up some sputum, and then we put some of it on a slide and we count the cells and type the cells, and we also have the supernatant and we have a sputum plug. And we use those to do microbiome and epigenetics and characterize the cell type. And this is a characterization done by an Australian colleague, and he has 4 types, but essentially the first 2 are lots of eosinophils and neutrophils, lots of neutrophils, not many of either. And what we found in this studies in the lung is virtually the same as what I found in the paper from 20 years before, where we just looked at skin prick tests. So this is Brazil, Ecuador, New Zealand, Uganda, United Kingdom. And for example, New Zealand is actually much more eosinophilic than the others. In fact, you get even lower results for allergic asthma in low and middle income countries. But the blue here and the orange, if you combine those are people with lots of eosinophils in the lung. These are lots of neutrophils, and these are people who actually have no signs of inflammation in the lung at all. So that's another myth about asthma, that people say it's an allergic disease involving allergic inflammation of the lung. A lot of these kids have no inflammation. What's happening? Well, if you read the asthma textbooks back from the 1950s, before immunology took over the field, asthma was described as a neurological disease. Bronchospasm is a neurological effect, and there's a whole bunch of neural mechanisms that can tighten up the airways muscles and set off asthma attacks. So in the second study in camera, we're particularly looking at these other neurological mechanisms. This is the proportion of asthma due to essentially eosinophilia, which is allergy. New Zealand, UK, Brazil, Ecuador, Uganda. And you can see basically it hovers around 50% in each place, but it's a little bit lower in the low and middle income countries and a little bit higher in the Western countries. Finally, I won't go through this slide in detail, but one of the other things we're doing is try to look at allergy in more detail, because as I mentioned before, some of these people who have eosinophilia in the lungs or react to skin prick tests, some of them will have asthma and allergy, but they won't have allergic asthma. They will have, the allergy will be coincidental. It's just like the 35% of non-asthmatics in the New Zealand study reacted to these tests. So how do you find those? You know, if someone has asthma and they don't have allergy, then you could develop new medicines to manage those, and that's starting to happen. But how can you tell if someone has asthma and the allergy is coincidental? Well, you can look at their allergy reaction. This is looking at serum-specific IgE in blood in our our 5 WASP centres plus some other European centres. And what we're doing, instead of just doing skin prick tests where you maybe test for a dozen things, there's a company called Fadia which has a method called Isaac, a different spelling of Isaac, where you can test for 112 different allergic reactions, and you can look for combinations. And what we're trying to do is find out whether there will be people who don't have asthma who react to these tests, and if we can find a signature that's characteristic of them, then if someone has asthma and has allergy, but they have that particular signature, they have that particular combination, it means the allergy is probably coincidental to their asthma. So that's something we're still working on, and I won't go any more into these 2 studies except just to make the point that you'll see we started with the big picture of the population, and now we're down to doing lab-based studies. And that's the right order of starting. You need to look at the big picture, and then you get ideas, and then you can start to look at the individual and laboratory level. So I've studied asthma for 35 years. I really have no idea what causes it, but this is the sum total of my knowledge. It's a disease of westernisation. The global patterns and time trends are not explained by established risk factors. Reduced biodiversity may play a role. Only about a half of cases involve allergic mechanisms. Non-allergic asthma is important, particularly for management. And some patients may have asthma and allergy, but they don't necessarily have allergic asthma. So there's a whole bunch of stuff we're doing exploring this further. Okay, so the second topic I want to talk about is chronic kidney disease of unknown cause. And this is something I've been doing for about 10 years with a nephrologist at UCL in London called Ben Kaplan. Ben knocked on my door about 10 years ago and got me interested in this issue. And the story really starts in Central America. There's been a dramatic increase of chronic kidney disease of unknown origin. Now, unknown, what that means is most kidney disease people have diabetes and hypertension. And there's a couple of other things they may have in standard CKD. But these are young people who don't have diabetes or hypertension, and they have very severe kidney disease. And there's actually been tens of thousands of deaths of young people in Central America in the last 20, 30 years through this CKD of unknown cause. It was first identified in sugarcane workers. Some people think it's just a disease of sugarcane workers, but it's not true, but it is a bit more common in them. Primarily affecting adult male agricultural workers and particularly sugarcane workers. It's also in India. These are some photos I took. It's up the east coast of India near Orissa state. So this is a village where they mostly grow coconuts and they have plenty of water and they don't use many pesticides, which are some of the risk factors I'll come to. This village is the other side of the road. So these are about 2 kilometres apart. This village is being decimated by CKDU. We talked to the head man, we talked to the GP, there's just a huge number of cases. This village, there's no problem. And actually this village has all the risk factors that I'm about to talk about, and this doesn't. So you get these really weird patterns in villages that are very close to each other. It's also common in Sri Lanka. This is a screening survey that was done when they realised there was a problem. They started to screen people, and they found that there's a big problem in the centre of the country. There's actually not much of a problem in the north, which is the hottest part, which is something I'll come back to. But this established that there was a big problem. And these are the sorts of risk factors that people think might be causing it. And obviously, agricultural workers, they get dehydrated, there's heavy metals in the water, there's agrochemicals, there's infectious diseases, they take a lot of NSAIDs to reduce the pain of heat stress, there's a lot of illegal alcohol consumption, so there's a whole bunch of risk factors. And most people who have studied this have given up. Well, they haven't given up, but they look for everything, nothing seems to work, and then they say it must be multifactorial. And that's possible, but actually a lot of disease is multifactorial, but most epidemics are not multifactorial. The epidemic of lung cancer was caused by one factor, which is smoking, and that's true of most epidemics. So I think it's more likely that there's one single factor that we just haven't found yet, we haven't discovered. And this has happened before. There've been these regional epidemics of CKDU before, and the best known one is Balkan nephropathy. And epidemiologists studied it for decades, had all the same hypotheses I've just listed, and came to nothing. And then there was an outbreak of CKDU in Belgium caused by Chinese herbal medicines. And they realised that the Chinese herbal medicines had aristolochic acid in them, which is produced by a weed which grows amongst the wheat in the Balkans. And so they went back and they found the factor and they basically found the cause. So I think with these epidemics in Central America and South Asia, Sri Lanka and South India, I don't think it is multifactorial. I think there is a single cause, which we're still trying to find. And we're getting a little bit closer, as I'll show you in a moment, but we haven't discovered the cause yet. In Sri Lanka, at last count, there have been 37 hypotheses suggested as the possible cause, which is one thing I remind a lot of people say, well, just do an intervention study. Problem with doing an intervention study is you use up all your money and all your goodwill. And which of the 37 hypotheses are you going to pick for the intervention study? You have to have some idea as to which are the most plausible hypotheses. Now, some colleagues in Sri Lanka about 5 years ago decided they knew the answer. They knew it was due to pesticides. And the researcher was very influential with the president, and as a result, the Sri Lankan government banned most pesticides. And within a year, they were having to import a third of their rice. And then, for various reasons, including a bit of corruption, they ran out of foreign exchange, and that's why the government collapsed in Sri Lanka about 3 years ago, and they still haven't fully recovered. So you have to be careful when you put forward these hypotheses, because they can have unintended effects. In India and Sri Lanka, most people think it's either something in the water, like heavy metals, or pesticides. In Central America, some people think it's pesticides, and some people think it's heat stress. And particularly, there's a group that has been lobbying very hard, saying it's due to heat stress, and let's just intervene and stop messing about. So we decided to learn from the example of Isaac and say, the very first thing you should do with any disease is say, who gets this disease? Person, place, and time. Do the basic descriptive epidemiology. So we developed this protocol called degree. We called it degree at the time because I thought that heat stress was the most important thing. I don't believe that anymore. And we published this a couple of months ago, and this is the world's first CKDU map. And we have maps for women and men and urban and rural areas, but I'll just show this one because the main concern is men in rural areas. And what you see is there's definitely a problem in Central America, and there's definitely a problem in South Asia, in Sri Lanka and South India. Nowhere else in the world shows any problem at all. None of these have a prevalence of 0 because CKD can always, in any population, it will occur in, for some reason, in a few people that we don't understand. But also, because it's a definition by exclusion, you find people with CKD and then you exclude those with diabetes and hypertension. There's a lot can go wrong there with misclassification. So anywhere in the world, you'll find 1 or 2% of people of middle age have CKD for some unknown reason. So they get classified as CKDU. But, and that's a problem. For example, the heat stress enthusiasts, they're finding cases all over the world, but it's just a few cases. You can go to London and find cases. I know 2 people in London who have CKDU. So you can find cases anywhere. You've got to do proper population surveys, and this is the first one that's been done. These are prevalence in men and prevalence in women. So places like the UK, it's down here, it's less than 2%. If it's above 5%, it's a problem. You can see that most of the centres that are above 5% are in men, but there's also some where it's increased in both men and women. And to our great surprise, we found 2 centres in India and 1 in Ecuador where it's raised in women rather than men. It's always rural areas. It's never been found in urban areas. Now, one criticism of this is that, well, people had really been predicting there was a global epidemic, and there was stories about this in Science and various magazines, and there's been a lot of publicity about it, but there is no global epidemic. There's 2 regional epidemics which may well have different causes. One criticism of this is that, well, there might be pockets of, you know, like this is a survey in Thailand, it's a national survey, but maybe there's some areas that have a problem. And that's certainly possible, but no one has found one yet. And one that gets quoted a lot is, if I can find Nepal here, this was a national survey, but it's quoted a lot that the workers from Nepal who went to the World Cup in Qatar had extreme heat stress. And once again, you get anecdotal reports of cases of CKDU. And so this is the population which many people have claimed must be having a big problem with CKDU because of heat stress. Now, we've done a survey. Well, some colleagues have done a survey, and we helped. And this is non-migrants in the area of Nepal, which most of the Qatar workers came from. These are people who worked overseas in the past, and these are people who worked overseas recently, almost all of whom worked in the Qatar World Cup. And 40% of them reported extreme heat stress. There had been some people who died of heat stress. This is the prevalence of CKDU, 0.6. There's absolutely nothing there. And this is a population which has had extreme heat stress. And this is one of my favourite examples where finding nothing can be really important, because it tells you whatever else is happening, heat stress is not the main cause of the epidemics in these two regions. Okay, so now we've looked at the big picture. You can start to look at the individual level and the molecular level. So, as well as the protocol for degree, we publish a protocol for doing, the idea is if you find a population which has a problem, then you do a cohort study in that population. So this is a protocol we published for doing that. The cohort study that's most advanced is done by Marvin Gonzalez with us in Nicaragua. So it's right up near the border with El Salvador. It's very rural villages. I've only been there once. Ben, the nephrologist, goes there every year, and we've done, I think, 8 years of surveys. I went there once. You had to leave the hotel at 1:30 a.m. and drive for 2 hours, and in the middle of the jungle near the sugarcane plantations, you'd find the villages. And take measurements for some of the men before they go to work. It was mostly men. And then at 4:30, you had to hide everything in the jungle while the bus from the sugarcane company came by. And then once the bus had gone by, everything came out again and we'd finished doing the survey. And in those circumstances, Marvin was getting more than 90% response rates in all these very isolated villages. And this is the 2-year follow-up. And I'm getting into some more complicated statistics now. But these are all people under 30. And we excluded anyone who was known to have CKD of any type. And what we found, and this is the EGFR, it's the glomerular filtration rate, and normal was up above 100, and below 60. If you're below 60 repeatedly, that's CKD. And we found 3 groups. We found that about 10% of them had very low kidney function anyway. They just didn't know it, because you don't get symptoms. By the time you get symptoms, you're almost dead, and a few people in the study have died. About 80% of them were fine, but 10% of them started completely fine and lost 1/3 of their kidney function in 2 years. And no one's ever seen anything like this anywhere else in the world. It's an absolutely dramatic drop in kidney function. So our first thought was, well, let's compare this group to the group that stayed stable and look at their baseline values for a whole bunch of things. We measured the water, we had heavy metals, we had a questionnaire about lots of exposures and so on, and see what's different between these two groups. And we didn't actually find very much. And we asked about heat stress and so on, which had a very weak effect. So then we thought, well, the problem is that there's factors that cause the initial condition and there's factors that hasten the decline. So what we really want to do is not look at people when they're declining, but look at what happened just before they started to decline. And so we got some friends involved and did a Markov chain analysis, which is was the first time I'd been involved in one. And the idea is that you have 2 states, which are healthy and unhealthy. So the dark line is healthy and the dotted line is unhealthy. And you don't just look at baseline, you look at each time point. So maybe someone declines between year 4 and year 5, then you look at all the things you can measure for year 4 and see what predicted the decline. And then we started to get some more interesting findings. So these are people who basically had no decline, and this is from time 0 to year 8. Whereas these are people who somewhere along the way suddenly had this big drop in kidney function. And what was happening to them, or what were they doing at the time? Well, the things we find that there's an association with sugarcane work, though I should stress that most of these people are not sugarcane workers, they're other agricultural workers. There's a weak association with sun exposure at work, but what we find particularly is weight loss of more than 2 kilograms, unintentional weight loss, cramps, nausea, vomiting, and this is just in the period before they started to go down rapidly. And this can't be a result of CKD. CKD doesn't cause these symptoms. Heat stress could cause some of them, but then we got into the expensive lab stuff, and we did proteomics, and I don't claim to understand all of the markers here, so I won't try and explain them, but what you test, tens of thousands of proteomic measures, and these are the ones that come out in this group, and basically they're all markers of a massive response to an antigen. And what can cause that sort of response? Well, in Western countries it can be a drug reaction or some herbal medicines, but also we know in low and middle income countries that it can be caused by a worm infection or by a tick or by some other of the various bad things that can happen to you if you're living and working in the jungle. So we'd like to do a scan of these, but there's several 100,000 things you could test for, and we're just trying to work out what to test for. But I think what's happening is there is some local event like that, like a massive response to some sort of antigen, like from a worm or a tick. And people are having this massive response which pushes them over the limit and their kidney function starts to decline. Once it starts to decline, things like heat stress will speed up the decline, but they won't be what gave you the disease in the first place. In fact, if you took patients from here, put them in the sugarcane fields in Nicaragua, their kidney disease would get worse very rapidly, but it wouldn't be what gave them the kidney disease in the first place. It's likely to be some other factor which we're still trying to find. Okay, so what do these two examples have in common? Well, if you look at the asthma example, all of these things are what people think cause asthma, with the possible exception of stress, and some genetic factors which play a minor role. They don't actually cause asthma. They're secondary causes. If you have asthma, they set off attacks, and that's what the doctors and the patients notice. And so they think that's what gave them asthma in the first place. But and they will affect prevalence, because the more attacks you're having, the longer you have the disease, you don't lose it. But there's very little evidence that any of these factors cause you to get asthma in the first place. Just for example, there's almost no evidence that air pollution causes asthma. And in the Isaac study, in fact, the areas with the highest air pollution actually have very low asthma, and you see this all around the world. It's not that it's protective, it just doesn't affect asthma risk either way. Once you've got asthma, it sets off attacks. So it's a secondary cause, not a primary cause. You see the same thing even stronger with pollen exposure and hay fever, which we also looked at in Isaac. Isaac showed conclusively that if you grow up in an area with lots of pollens, you have a lower risk of hay fever. If you have hay fever like me, then you react during the pollen season. But the initial exposure, actually, it's better to have an exposure early on, and it lowers the risk. And we thought we'd discovered something clever until we found a book published in London in 1873 which said exactly the same thing and predicted that hay fever would become more common as people moved to the cities. Same thing applies to dust mite exposure. 25 years ago we thought we could solve asthma. You kill the cat, get rid of the carpet, and now we've done or found a lot of studies that show that owning a cat early in life protects you. So I have no idea how to prevent asthma, but I have saved the lives of a lot of cats, so that must, have some public health benefit. And same with dust mite exposure. There've been a lot of intervention studies reducing dust mite exposure in children with a family history of asthma. You do things like fit plastic covers to the mattresses and kill the cat, get rid of the carpet and so on. None of them have worked. For children who have asthma, if you intervene and lower their allergen exposure, there is some small benefit, but no study has followed people for longer than 6 months. And we know with a lot of these allergic diseases that, for example, if I move to a new city like London, it's well documented that in the first year you don't get the hay fever symptoms, you get them the second year, because it takes 1 year for your immune system to adapt to the new allergens and then react to them. So these are all secondary causes, they're not primary causes, and some of them may actually prevent asthma. And then in terms of all these likely causes of CKD, most of these decline in pre-existing CKD, they're secondary causes, and most are probably not primary causes, though we're still looking at some of the infectious diseases that may be involved in this antigen reaction that I've been talking about. But it certainly applies to heat stress. Now, particularly with the Nepal study, which incidentally we're having trouble getting published because no one wants to publish a negative result, so we've put it on medRxiv and we'll keep trying with the journals. You can say pretty conclusively that heat stress is not causing an international epidemic of CKDU. It's causing lots of other problems, and climate change is a bad thing. And intervening to make working conditions better is a good thing, but it's not what's causing these two epidemics. And I think there's actually two regional epidemics which probably have different causes. One in Central America and one in South Asia, just like the one in the Balkans had this particular cause of aristolochic acid. So what do these two examples have in common? The secondary causes, the exacerbating factors, are largely known, and it is these that are most noticed by doctors and patients. The primary causes, the initiating factors, are unknown, both for asthma and for CKDU. It's highly unlikely that the primary causes will be discovered solely by studies at the individual level, either by RCTs or carefully designed observational studies. It's really this interaction between what you see at the population level, the individual level, and what you see in the lab that's important, and you need to continually go back and forth between them. So going on further about what they have in common, the important thing is the interaction between studies at the population level and the individual level. Secondly, you've got to have some biological knowledge to make any sense of these two diseases. All of these studies involve primary data collection. None of them involved electronic health records. They're just either not available or they're not accurate enough. And it's something that drives me mad, particularly in the UK. Electronic health record studies are great. I do some of them, people in my group do them. They're great when they work. But in the UK, if you bring up any example like this, they say, well, can you do it in Biobank or one of the other cohorts, or can you do it with electronic health records? Well, actually you can't. You have to go out and collect the data, and it's a bit of a tragedy that most EPI students these days don't collect any data. They just analyse these records that someone else has collected, and therefore they don't really understand the strengths and weaknesses. The processes of causal discovery and causal inference involve a wide variety of evidence, like I talked about earlier today. Difficulties. No understanding of the value of descriptive epidemiology. Before you spend millions on lab tests or doing the complicated analysis, just do the descriptive epidemiology first. But no one wants to fund that. Isaac and Degree really were done without any funding. There was a couple of centres we got funded for Degree, and Isaac people found their own funding, but no one wants to fund this sort of stuff. But it's actually quite important, particularly if you want to actually solve the problem. There's the people, particularly for CKDU, who say we already know the answer, we should intervene, which at least in the case of Sri Lanka was fairly disastrous. And a big problem is the causal inference fanatics who I talked about earlier today that think that only certain study designs are valid for causal inference, and that population comparisons or ecologic studies or prevalence studies are no use. The problem is if you only focus on things that meet this very pure theory, I would have had no slides to present, basically. And to actually find out the answer to something, which I'm quite keen on doing, you have to use whatever works, and you have to use a wide variety of methods. So my last slide is to go back to the importance of population level studies. If we see differences between populations, this shows that there is a public health problem that should be solved, like the epidemic of CKDU in Central America, or the increasing prevalence of asthma as countries get more Western. And also that there's a scientific question that can be solved. Richard Dole, who did a lot of the most famous studies ever, including smoking and lung cancer, I know one colleague who asked Richard, this guy went and worked for Richard Dole then at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And after about a year, he worked out that Richard was quite famous. And he said, "How come you're so famous?" And Richard Dole said, "Because I only study things that are easy." And smoking and lung cancer is easy. When you've got an epidemic, there must be an explanation. If the disease has the same prevalence everywhere in the world, then it's going to be much harder to find out the causes. But if there's an epidemic, it's not only important in public health terms, but it's actually a good opportunity scientifically. And comparisons of findings between populations can lead to the discovery of new risk factors for disease. For example, most of what we know about cancer and heart disease, all of the ideas came from the sort of population comparisons that we've done for Isaac and Degree, which no one wants to do anymore. So, for example, in the 1950s and 60s, IARC published cancer incidence in 5 continents, and people realised for the first time that colorectal cancer was high in Europe and low in Africa, and it might be something to do with fibre and fruit and vegetables in the diet. They realised that hepatitis B was really high in Asia, and initially they thought it was aflatoxins due to mouldy peanuts, and that plays a small role, but eventually they worked out it was due to hepatitis B. Even the hypothesis that HPV, human papillomavirus, causes cervical cancer, that hypothesis that there was an infectious cause came initially out of population comparisons. So almost everything that's important we know about the causes of the main disease today came from those population comparisons. And after that, you did the individual level studies, and after that, you did the laboratory studies. Also, these population comparisons provide a reality check on findings about established risk factors at the individual level. So, if you look at Isaac, the global map, you realise that actually maybe allergens or air pollution doesn't explain the global patterns, and maybe heat stress doesn't explain the global pattern for CKD. They facilitate triangulation of findings across populations, and as you have seen, they provide etiological clues when we see different findings at the populations and the individual level. And it's most interesting when you find an association at one level and not at another level. So that's the dog that didn't bark in the night. So thank you.